Yeah, let's get started. Good afternoon. My name is Brandon Moore. I am the National Campaign Director at Defend Our Health. Defend Our Health is a nonprofit that works to protect public health. We fight to ensure that all people have access to safe food and drinking water, healthy homes, and products that are toxic free and climate friendly. For today's discussion, we are joined by Dr. Shanna H. Swan, a professor of environmental medicine and public health at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York. Dr. Swan has worked for over 25 years to understand the threats posed by chemicals to our environment and our health. Of most concern to Dr. Swan are endocrine disrupting chemicals like phthalates. Dr. Swan recently published the book Countdown, How Our Modern World is Threatening Sperm Counts, Altering Male and Female Reproductive Development, and Imperiling the Future of the Human Race. So quite the scary title there. Let's start there with your book, Dr. Swan. I think that's the best place to start. In your book, Countdown, you argue that plastics and modern chemicals have contributed to a 50% decline in sperm counts over the past 40 years. In addition to that decline in female reproductive markers as well. In your view, what are the major causes of this decline, and how do we get here?
So, first of all, let me just say the decline is a decline in sperm quality, semen quality, but there have also been declines in other parameters that reflect male and female reproductive health, as well as the health of other species on the planet. So while we enter this question, if you will, with semen quality, it's certainly not limited to that, okay? So what triggered this book was a paper on sperm decline. And that was a paper that we published in 2017, where we showed that sperm counts and concentration in Western countries had declined more than 50% over the past 40 years. It's an extremely dramatic decline. And it's also very important because where we were at the end of our study period, which was the last year that samples were collected for this analysis, that was 2011, so 10 years ago, the median sperm concentration, the middle value for sperm concentration, was 47 million sperm per milliliter. And that was down from 99 just 39 years prior to that. So 99 to 47, that's a decrease of over 50%. And more importantly, perhaps, the number 47 is extremely low, and we can talk about what that number means. But now, then as to causes, that is a much harder question in a sense. I mean, this was hard enough doing this meta-analysis, but what are the causes of this decline? There are certainly many. So let me just break them down a little bit. So when we talk about causes, we first say, well, gene and environment are the big players, right? But genes here are not going to be doing it, not all by themselves, perhaps influenced by environment, because genetic changes, evolutionary changes are much, much slower than 2 generations. We're only talking about 2 generations, so at most. So something has been going on over those 40 or perhaps 50 years that is driving this, which is not going to be genetically based. Okay, so what could that be? That could be environment. So environment is huge, right? It's a huge topic. And I like to break it down into lifestyle factors and chemicals. And so the lifestyle factors are things like smoking, alcohol, obesity, lack of exercise, stress, diet. All of those things are important. And yes, all of those things can affect sperm count. But they do it in a somewhat different way in that they're usually things that people are exposed to postnatally. In fact, most often as adults when they worry about how much they smoke and drink and stress they have and so on. And that will affect the actual value of the sperm count. But then there's a whole other class of exposures. Those are the chemical exposures, which tend more likely to be prenatal. And it is when there are prenatal, they're going to have a much bigger impact, and they're going to change things permanently. So we'll come back to that later, maybe. So what are those things? So we all know that we're exposed to, tens of thousands of chemicals. Probably the CDC measures over 100 in people in the US every couple of years. And we know that we have these tremendous exposures, and we know that many of them are acting on our body's hormones. So these are the chemicals that concern me most, the chemicals we're exposed to on a daily basis that can impact our body's natural hormones. And why do I care about those particularly? I care about those because those are the things that are going to affect our biological systems, which depend on our body's natural hormones. Okay? So what kinds of chemicals are we talking about? Well, I'm talking about phthalates, which are the chemicals that I've studied most closely. A couple of words about phthalates are that these are chemicals found in plastics, among other places. Mm-hmm. They make plastic soft and flexible. And so other phthalates are found in personal care products. They make the personal care products become absorbed into our skin more readily. You want to put on a sunscreen, you want it to go into your skin. Phthalates help with that. They're found in medical devices, very importantly, through plastic tubing. They're found in many, many products in our homes. And food is a really major source of these exposures. So moving on from phthalates to another class, there's the phenols, the bisphenols. And these are, let me go back to phthalates for a second and say that many of these have the property of reducing testosterone. They're called anti-androgens. And that's sort of their chemical nature and what's so important to us in terms of reproduction. Now, if we go to phenols, bisphenols, those are estrogenic. And they also affect the body's hormones, and they through increasing estrogen or possibly decreasing androgens as well. And so these are also in plastics, but they make plastic hard. Phthalates make it soft. Bisphenols make it hard. They're also found in linings in tin cans. They're also found in cash register receipts, pizza boxes. They're really sneaky and all over the place. And they're definitely affecting our reproductive systems. Then we move on to another class. We can talk about pesticides. People are very aware of pesticides. They try to eat if they can afford it and if they can find it. Food that's pesticide-free or organic. This is important because pesticides, and there's a huge number of them, can act on our body's hormones in many, many, many ways, including by lowering androgens and by increasing estrogens. And then we can go to the flame retardants, which are obviously in our products in our daily lives, in our furniture, in our carpets, in our kids' clothes, and in fire extinguishing materials. And they're also endocrine active and have the ability to affect our body's hormones. And finally, the last class that I'm going to mention is the PFAS chemicals. And I know that Defend Our Health has been working very hard on these chemicals and trying to alert us to these and get them out of our systems, because they are also extremely threatening to our health and our reproductive health. And for example, they're in coatings, right? So coatings of pans, like Teflon pans, coating of our jackets when we make them water repellent, coatings of our paper when we make them oil resistant, and so on and so forth. So if we want to think of these classes as a group, we're thinking about endocrine disrupting chemicals, all of them having the ability to affect our hormones and affect our health. And I should say most critically in the prenatal period.
That's very informative. Thanks, Dr. Swan. I think one of the classes of chemicals we will want to dive a little bit deeper in with the Toxic Free Food campaign are phthalates. So you mentioned in the book the Better Living Through Chemistry era, which was post-World War II, where a lack of regulation and increased consumer demand led to growth in the production and use of plastics and consequently chemicals in plastics. And then one of those chemicals, of course, was phthalates. I want you to talk a little bit more about what impact these chemicals have exactly on our reproductive health. And you touched on it a little bit, but can you go a little bit deeper on how phthalates enter our body?
Absolutely, Brandon. I've been studying the action of phthalates on our bodies and our reproductive health for about 20 years. And I think people might be amused to know that I started looking at phthalates because a chemist friend of mine suggested it. And he said, Shanna, you should study phthalates. And I said, what are phthalates? So that's how ignorant I was at the time of phthalates. But most people were, because they weren't in the conversation. And that was around 2000. So quite a while ago. And we were just learning. We were learning that these were in our bodies. And how did we learn that? We learned that because CDC had looked. CDC had developed the ability to measure these chemicals fairly inexpensively in small samples in lots of people. And that was part of the NHANES survey, National Health Examination Nutrition Examination Survey, which they conducted for every 2 years for a very long time. And so that's actually invaluable. And I don't know of another country in the world that does this, by the way, to have this kind of monitoring, to tell us what the exposure levels are, who is exposed, older people, younger people, Black people, white people, children, adults, and so on and so forth, is very, very important because that tells us something about the sources and who's most at risk, right? So this chemist friend of mine worked at CDC. His name was John Brock, and he said, you should study phthalates. So he told me the story, and then he told me the second half of the story. And he said that the National Toxicology Program had been looking at these and looking at their reproductive toxicity and discovering that when the mother was exposed to several of these phthalates, that her male offspring were not as male typical as they might have been if they were unexposed. So they compared higher exposure, lower exposure, and they showed that when the mother had a higher exposure, particularly at a short window in pregnancy, at early pregnancy, then the sons, the males that are born, had genitals which were less male typical. So what does that mean? That means that on average, when these phthalate levels, and there's three particularly that at that time were singled out, like we can talk DEHP, DBP, and BBCP. Never mind, they're in polyvinyl chloride, they make plastic soft, they're all in our daily lives. And so what they found was that when the mother was exposed to one of these chemicals or multiple, that the males had shorter distance from the anus to the genitals. Now that sounds really obscure and really weird, and why would you care about that? I'm going to tell you why. Okay, but before I do, let me just tell you some of the other changes. They measured the penis width, and that was smaller. The penile length was shorter. There was less complete descent of the testicles into the scrotum, and there were other birth defects associated with these chemicals. Okay, so in general, there was not, if you think about the transition from a neutral genital tract, which is what happens, to the masculine genital tract, male typical, that is a XY individual, that happens early in pregnancy under the influence of testosterone. Now, I told you that phthalates lower testosterone. So you can imagine that if testosterone is lowered at this critical time, this migration, if you will, from the undifferentiated genital tract to the male typical is incomplete. That's what phthalates do. But before I go to another question, I want to tell you about this anogenital distance. It sounds weird, it sounds very esoteric, but actually kids on the street talk about it all the time. And they call it the taint, the gooch, the grundle. Okay, you know it, right? Now you know it, okay. And I have to, let me share with you, I was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he said he's going to give me the title of the Paul Revere of tiny penises and taints. Okay. All right. So that says to you that this distance is very important for my research. Why is it so important? Well, it's important because in a XY male typical individual, that distance will be about twice as long, 50 to 100% as long as in a female. And if you think about what's going on down there, there's a lot of real estate to fit in. And so it's much bigger. It grows. It's much bigger. Okay. However, when, like I told you, there wasn't enough testosterone, then it's not so big. It's more shorter. It's more female typical. Okay. So when a baby's born, you can look at that distance and say, how much testosterone did that baby see in utero? It's like a window into a black box. There's no way we could know how much testosterone the baby saw, except that this reads it out. It reads it out for us, like a thermostat reads out a temperature, right? And this happens on the female side too, by the way. If the female sees too much testosterone, as you could guess, that distance for her is longer than expected. And we see that, for example, we published on this, that girls born to women who had PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, that's a condition where the mother produces more testosterone. And when she has a girl, that girl will reflect that with her AGD, and so on and so forth. The other reason that this distance is so important is it tells us something about how that infant is going to function in terms of reproductive health when he or she grows up. But let me come back to that in a minute. So John Brock told me this story. He said, these scientists showed that there was a, quote, phthalate syndrome. This was very big news because there's few syndromes like that attached to a chemical. We don't talk about a bisphenol syndrome. We don't talk about a PFAS syndrome, right? But we talk about a phthalate syndrome. So it's very specific to these phthalates, and or perhaps to other anti-androgens. We don't know that, but it's called the phthalate syndrome. And so I asked, okay, maybe I could look, because I study humans, I don't study animals. Maybe I could look in humans and say, do we see a human phthalate syndrome? And nobody had asked that. So I wasn't sure how to do it exactly, but I was fortunate in having stored urine of pregnant women from a study I had designed and carried out of pregnant women and their partners. Okay, that had been completed. The babies had been born, but I had saved the urine. I wasn't sure why I was going to use the urine, but luckily I had it. So I sent it off to CDC, and I got money first to do this, by the way, which always takes a couple of years. But anyway, so I sent it off to CDC. They measured the phthalates in the urine, and I had one half of the equation. So what's the equation? Phthalates in, genital changes out. That's what I wanted to examine. Okay, so I had the urine, I had the measured phthalate levels, and then I had to look at the genital changes. And so what I did was I found all the babies I could that had been born to those couples, brought them back for an exam, designed an exam that mimicked the rodent exam, right, to the extent that I could. And I looked at their penis size, at their anogenital distance size, at their testicular descent, at their scrotal size, all these things that the animal people had looked at, and I found it. I found the phthalate syndrome in humans. This was big news, actually. It really showed that these phthalates cause this condition, because we'd seen it in animals, we'd seen in the laboratory that these phthalates lower testosterone. It all fit together. But I wasn't happy with that yet. I felt like I had to do it again, because replication is really the essence of science, isn't it? So I applied for more money. I was successful, thank goodness. I got a new cohort. I got pregnant women. I got their urine in each trimester. I measured them for phthalates. I got the babies, and at birth, I measured them because that's what the animals had, they'd done with the animals. And I found it again. And we published that second one 10 years later, 2015. So with that arc of 15 years of research, we showed that phthalates cause the phthalate syndrome in humans. But that's not the end of the story, because there are no sperm there. No fertility there. These are
Okay.
newborns. So how do you get to that stage? Well, to get to that stage, you have to jump a little bit. And the way you jump is to say, okay, in animals, this marker, AGD, is permanent. So when a mouse or a rat is born with a short AGD for his size, then when he grows up, it's going to be short for his size. You with me? Okay. All right. So if that's true for humans, and we don't actually know that, I have to confess to you, Brandon, this is a missing link. It's not absolutely pinned down, but it's likely because everything else agreed between humans and animals. Okay, if that's true, then an adult man, his AGD should tell him something about his sperm count, right? So we did that study too, got more money, collected news, and this population had to be adults. So what we did was I was at University of Rochester, we got students in the college, we put up notices in the bathrooms and in the gyms, and we said, come and give us a sample and we'll pay you $75. Easy. Lots of guys want to do that. And so
I would have done it.
Yeah, sure, $75. Hey,
Absolutely.
you know?
Yeah.
And what they had to do was give us a sample and let us measure their AGD. They also completed a questionnaire and gave us urine and so on, but those were the two main things. And so we found and showed and published that when this AGD was shorter than expected, their sperm count was low. So it was a predictor of sperm count. And then Mike Eisenberg replicated this. He's in Stanford. And he also showed that men who were infertile had a short AGD. So when you put all that together, you go from phthalate exposure to the mother, function in the sons as adults.
Yeah.
That took, almost 25 years, but it really nailed it. And it's the best example we have of a direct link between an endocrine disrupting chemical and reproductive function.
Yeah, that's amazing. And thank you so much for doing that research and conducting that study. I guess the next question I have is also in the book, you refer to phthalates and other classes of chemicals as being the kind of silent, ubiquitous threats. And you mentioned, and we know this from testing of cheese and mac and cheese powder, that food can be a source of exposure to phthalates. You were recently quoted in the New York Times as saying phthalates are coming into our body through our skin, through our nose, we get them everywhere. But the primary source is food. How do phthalates enter our food supply?
Well, I would like to understand that better, Brandon, and I'm actually planning to do some studies to dig in and find out what are the entry points for these chemicals into our foods. But we know from studies where people have eaten, for example, organic foods or unprocessed foods, and they have much lower levels. So there's somewhere between the planting of I would say even the soil matters. The soil that the seed is planted in, the way it's fertilized, and the way it's processed between the farm and our table is going to be introducing these chemicals. And I'll give you a good example. But for that, I want to tell you something which is not about the farm for a minute. If you look at in a hospital, and you look at a newborn baby that's been born premature and has a lot of lines coming in a NICU, those lines contain phthalates. Those are soft plastic tubes, right? So they contain phthalates. And so when the nutrients go through those tubes and they go into the baby, phthalates go with them. And so in Mount Sinai and other hospitals, they've shown that the number of lines coming into that baby is directly related to the amount of phthalate in that baby's urine at the same time or immediately afterwards. So that just demonstrates that when you pass food through soft plastic tubing, the phthalates leave the tubing, go into the food goes into the body, gets into the urine, and then we measure it. Now, I believe, but have not proved, that the same thing happens, for example, with milk. You can have milk that's organic, wonderful, clean farm. The milk is collected in a milking machine, which is full of plastic tubing, right? And that milk then has to be processed. It goes to a processing plant. It's pasteurized. It's homogenized. Along the way, it almost surely picks up, and this we haven't tested, but this is my hypothesis now, almost surely picks up phthalates through that processing. Same thing with a tomato, might be grown in organic soil, picked cleanly, and then processed to make spaghetti sauce, tomato soup, and so on. Put in cans that are lined, by the way, with bisphenol A, put in packages that are plastic, shipped in plastic, stored in plastic, and for some people, unfortunately, even heated in plastic, which is the biggest no-no. So, and this is, you work on this, Defend Our Health works in this, and I look forward to working with you on this question, because I want to identify exactly where in that distribution chain the phthalates enter the food so that we can prevent that.
Absolutely.
And keep your food safe. Yeah.
Absolutely. You touched a little bit on there about the farm and the processing. One of the other things we know is that these chemicals can also be found in the packaging.
Yes.
And so we recently completed a study with partners on phthalates in bottle cap liners, and we're releasing a public report in June. And when we collected these caps to study, there are a lot of people who thought that something as small as a bottle cap doesn't matter. But can you maybe shed a little bit of a light on why, or tell us why you think we should care about the chemicals that go into everyday products like bottle cap liners, even in small amounts?
Small amounts matter, and we ignore that to our peril, I think. I think that the idea that you need a big exposure to have any impact on health is absolutely false. And it may even be that for some chemicals, having a low exposure might be actually more risky for some endpoints. So again, I like to look at animal models, but I'll just say in a rodent, there are lots of animals in the litter, right? A rodent might have 10, 12, 14. Okay, yeah. And it turns out that the sex of the neighbor, say a little male rodent is in the womb next to two females, he will get some estrogen from those females, measurably changing his hormone levels, and a female between two males measurably has her hormone levels changed by her partner's sex. Okay, now this is important because the amount that's transferred, think about it, has to be transferred from one pup to the other just because they're next to them in the womb. Okay, tiny, like a drop in a swimming pool amount of chemical is transferred. So it should not be surprising to us that very low levels of chemicals cause harm, change our physiology at the right time. Now, this is particularly a problem for prenatal exposures, which are the most sensitive, okay? I don't know that the same is true for adult exposure, but it's also concerns me because these things are not things we're exposed to one at a time. We're exposed to hundreds, if not thousands, of these chemicals. We know they interact. We know that the whole is worse than the sum of its parts, if you will. And people can think about that on their own when they think about the drugs they take, the medications they take. They go to the doctor. The doctor says, tell me everything you're taking, right? And why is that? That's because it matters, because mixtures matter. Mixing up these chemicals matter because multiple exposures can be worse than than the sum of each individually. So for all of these reasons, I would say we need to worry about small exposures. And again, I stress particularly either when the woman is pregnant or when the man is preparing to conceive a pregnancy. That means the 60 to 70 days during which the sperm that's going to create that child is being produced. That's a long time, 2+ months. He's got to be careful what's going into his body.
That's helpful. Thank you so much. going back a little bit, earlier on you mentioned the CDC and their NHANES biomonitoring data. On that, I wonder, like, when it comes to phthalates, are we all equally exposed? And can you talk about if and how the impacts of endocrine disrupting chemicals are an environmental justice issue?
Thank you for asking that. And it's an issue that's only recently getting the attention that it deserves. I think that endocrine disruption and environmental chemicals is a huge environmental justice issue for three reasons. First of all, disadvantaged communities have higher exposure. This has been shown in multiple publications. You can also see it directly from the NHANES data because they table all the exposure levels by ethnicity, race, ethnicity. So there's higher exposure. The reasons for that have to do with availability of healthier choices, access to healthier foods, products, and so on. But the exposures are higher. The second point is that, and this is much less known, that the impacts of an adverse impact of a chemical tends to be, and we have shown is in some instances, greater for disadvantaged communities. And that's probably because people in those communities are suffering from health risks already, have a baseline risk of higher stress, higher various kinds of health problems. And then you put on top of that an environmental exposure, you have a bigger impact. And we have a paper that we just are about to submit, so I'm not going to tell you the details, but in our study in 4 cities in the United States, we found that one of these chemicals, not to be named, had a much greater impact in our single community that included a large number of African Americans. The other communities, which were white, middle class, we didn't see this impact. So I think there needs to be more research on the differential impact of environmental chemicals by race, ethnicity, economic status, and so on. And the third reason is that people who are disadvantaged have less access to alternatives. So we see in New York, in poor neighborhoods, people may have to go a very long distance to buy fresh food. It's just not there. It's not in the local grocery. Where are they going to get this? We tell people, eat fresh food. Great. How is that going to help them? That just makes them frustrated and angry, right? So fresh food access, organic food, you have to have the money to pay that extra quite a bit sometimes for the organic food. And then the cosmetics, the safer personal care products, the safer home products are always more expensive. So there's an economic impact to buying healthy. And I think we need to look at that and maybe consider subsidizing people so they can afford to buy healthy.
Yeah.
If we really think this is healthier, that should be part of their health care.
Absolutely. I mean, we talk about this chemical exposure, and I'm curious to know, like, is there a bad guy or what? I guess what factor or factors have kind of contributed to the ubiquitous presence of these chemicals? Like, how did we get here?
Well, I think the bad guy, if we had to name one, would be fossil fuel manufacturers or distributors, or those who lead fossil fuels into our life, because these chemicals are made from fossil fuel byproducts. They don't have to be, but that's how they've been made for most of these products for most of these years. The other thing that's played a big role is that, as you mentioned when we started our discussion, better living through chemistry became a buzzword, if you will, after World War II. People were enamored of science. They were enamored of chemistry. It had done very well, and it helped us win the war. Let's put it, plainly. But it should not have been given a clean bill of health to run amok and harm us, with uncontrolled chemical distribution. So we were in this situation where more and more chemicals were being produced. People were loving it. They were saying, get better living through chemistry. In fact, I saw an ad that said, plastics, an important part of a healthy diet. Honestly, that's hard to believe, but that was an ad. I have it.
Bizarre.
That's very bizarre. And it was, people were, that's not all I can say is in love with, this growth, which made us number one in the world and made us, live lives that we felt were better, but they weren't healthier. And in fact, the opposite. And we're just learning that. The other thing is that in 1976, when the Toxic Substances Control Act came along, all of those chemicals that had been produced in the 25 years previous, people said, well, they've been around a long time and we don't know of any harm they've caused, so we'll just let them in and we won't test them. Grandfathering in all of these chemicals without testing. And here we are.
What's one or even a few things that you mentioned, the fossil fuel manufacturers and I guess industry, the chemical industry in total, but like what's one or a few things that they can do about the impact they're having on fertility? And ultimately, I mean, I read something recently that plastic use and manufacture continues to rise. Yeah. And so it's done well for them. Why should they care about this issue?
Right. I don't think they will care about it on their own. I think what's going to happen is that people who are listening to this podcast, reading Countdown, I hope they will, talking to their legislators, talking to groups like you, supporting groups like you, Defend Our Health, and making a lot of noise. I think we're just at the point we're starting to recognize we have a big problem in the reproductive arena. And one of the reasons that people are recognizing that is they see that in their own bodies, in their own families, in their children, in their grandchildren. They have friends who have trouble conceiving. They have reproductive problems themselves. It's now very, very prevalent. The number of people going to assisted reproduction is climbing dramatically, and more couples are having trouble having babies. So I think people are starting to say, wait a minute, maybe this is true. Maybe we do have a reproductive problem. And when that happens, I think we can exert pressure through our buying and through our letter writing and through our contributions to turn this around. But it's a big lift. It's a very big lift because this has been accumulating for, almost 75 years. So, yeah.
Okay, so let's pretend in a world we're able to get industry to care about this issue through our advocacy work. What are the things that they could do that would improve the negative impact they're having on fertility?
Well, I think that we have to test chemicals at human relevant scenarios. That means test them in exposure situations, which is what we're exposed to, namely low doses and mixtures. And that's not how testing is done now. So you won't get the true answer if you only test at very high doses because you won't understand the risk of low doses. And you won't get the answer if you just test these one at a time because you won't see the danger of multiple exposures, which we know we're exposed to. So we have to test at human relevant scenarios. And we have to test those grandfathered in chemicals, and that's a big job, and we're going to have to get busy. And we may have to do things like looking at structural similarities between chemicals, looking at how they act together, and maybe control them as a class. And we're going to have to test chemicals before we add them to the marketplace. And this is something we haven't talked about, but I know but not everybody on the webinar knows that manufacturers have this habit, if you will, of taking out a chemical that people are concerned about and substituting a lookalike, which has the same risk. And that's happened I'll just tell you from my study, the phthalate that I was most concerned about, diethylhexyl phthalate, went down 50% in the 10 years between our two studies. And I was so excited. It's like, wow, we've really made a difference. And then I learned that other phthalates had come up to take its place. phthalates that had the same risk. That happened with bisphenol A being replaced by bisphenol F and bisphenol S and others. So you just tweak it a little bit, does the same thing, still makes the plastic hard. You can put the label BPA free on it because it's not BPA. It's impositor, if you will, for BPA, and people are tricked. I think it's a trick, and I hope people are getting angry about this.
I hope so too. We have two more questions, and before we take any other questions from folks on Facebook. So you just mentioned one of the things I really wanted to touch on, and your book discusses it as well, which is the regrettable substitutions, right? Like when you switch into a chemical that you think is safer. In your opinion, it sounds like you touched on it a bit, but what needs to happen to make sure we aren't stuck in a kind of a regrettable substitution cycle? And what are some of the policies that governments have adopted to get out of regrettable substitutions?
So I think that the chemical has to be tested and shown not to be endocrine active, to be safe in the scenarios that we've talked about before it's put into market. So that's not the case in the United States. Here we have the policy that it's safe until proven harmful. And I know from my own studies that proven harmful part takes a long time and a lot of money. And it's very hard to do for multiple chemicals at once. So it's up to the manufacturer to establish safety before it's marketed. And that is actually the policy in the EU right now. And so I like to give this example of what is banned from cosmetics in the EU products. There are 1,100, and in the United States, 11. So it's a 2 orders of magnitude different in what's allowed into products. I'm hoping this will have some economic impact on the U.S. when we can't export our cosmetics with all those 1,100 banned chemicals. We can't export them to Europe. Maybe that will open people's eyes. But in any case, it's their responsibility, I think, to test things before we are the guinea pigs for these products.
Great, thank you. I guess another question is that it feels like I know some people believe that they can avoid exposures to toxic chemicals by like shopping their way out of the problem, or with the lifestyle choices that you kind of mentioned before. And you do make some recommendations earlier in our conversation today. You mentioned, avoiding cigarette smoke, maintaining a healthy weight, and diet choices. But can that alone kind of solve the issue for folks, or does industry need to do work as well? What's your take on that?
So the modifications you suggested, like stopping smoking or limiting alcohol use and so on, that is great for your overall health and for your reproductive health, and we can do that. But that doesn't address the problem of the endocrine disrupting chemicals. And for that, I agree, we cannot shop our way out of this. We can shop more carefully, and I think people can do that. They can go to many websites, some of which are in Countdown, Environmental Working Group, and so on. But first of all, they may not actually be able to afford those other products, but also they may not be able to find them. And they won't know if they go to a store and pick up a product, a can of soup, a can of milk. It's not going to say whether it has phthalates in it. Phthalates, phenols are not labeled. They're not on the labels by and large. And so how can you shop? How can you shop better? You have to have the knowledge and the time to go to a website, to look up a product. That product has to be tested by that company. They have to put that up on their website. It's huge. That's not our responsibility. We shouldn't have to do that.
Thank you for that. I completely agree. We had a couple of questions come in really quickly, and I'll just ask those. So it says in the book, like, you describe a pretty bleak situation, but in your view, like, what are some of the silver linings you see in science advocacy and policy work around these harmful chemicals?
Um, why am I not in despair? I guess you're asking me, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'm not in despair because I feel a very different situation now than 20 years ago when I started working in this field. I feel that there is much more openness to considering the problem, to recognizing the problem, to taking action on the problem. Defend Our Health, all of these other advocacy groups didn't exist then. We have a lot of people mobilized now to make change, which is really important, and it's what it's going to take. I also am encouraged by the growing, science of assisted reproduction, which we're going to need more and more as we go forward, because this is getting, better and better. And I hope people maybe don't wait till the last minute to find out what their sperm count is. There are, you can get that checked. You can freeze your sperm. You can freeze your eggs. And that may sound kind of alarmist, but we take all kinds of insurance policies, and this, why not? I think that the living in this, world, this chemical infused world that we're in now, is posing a lot of risks. But the best news, I would say, came from Pat Hunt. She is a brilliant toxicologist at the University of Washington, and she showed that if you start with a male who's been affected by environmental chemicals, she used an estrogen, and then clean up his environment for 3 generations, no further endocrine disrupting exposure, his reproductive health is then restored. So I recommend this paper.
You can reverse the trend.
Exactly. You can reverse the trend. And many of these chemicals that we're exposed to, like the phenols and the phthalates, are not persistent. They are non-persistent chemicals. They leave our body very quickly. So if we can get them out of our lives, get them out of our homes, get them out of our food, we can restore our reproductive health. And that's what gives me hope.
And perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Swan. I think we'll end on that question. I don't think any other ones came through. Again, we want to thank you so much, Dr. Swan, for this incredibly interesting and informative discussion. As we mentioned before, Dr. Swan's book, Countdown, is available now. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And Defend Our Health will be releasing the report of our study on toxic bottle caps in the next 2 weeks. And we look forward to sharing that with all of you. But again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Swan.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.